Well, welcome everybody to the Masterclass this month, which is why revenue leaders are doubling down on sales methodologies. And super excited to have an incredible panelist today. So we've got Jen Allen-Knuth with us from Lavender. We have Andee Harris, the CEO from Challenger, and we have Jeff Roy from BioRender, the head of sales. And so we're gonna have a really interactive discussion. And I'm going to let them do a quick intro in a second. And then we're going to do kind of a quick icebreaker before we jump in. So why don't we start with intros with the panelists and in the same order that I introduce you. So Jen, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Jen Allen-Knuth. I head up community growth at a company called Lavender. It is a company that helps you write cold emails that don't do all the icky things your buyers hate. And I had the pleasure of working with Andee actually for years at Challenger. So I spent much of my career, 18 years as a salesperson. So it's my first official time as a marketer, still figuring it out. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. And for those of you that don't know, the Demand Jen with a J is probably the best handle I've ever heard. Andee, we'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Andee Harris. I'm the CEO of Challenger. I've been here about 2.5 years. For those of you that aren't familiar with Challenger, we are one of the methodologies that we'll be probably talking about today, but we are a sales training enablement methodology. My background is I've been everything from an AE to a CRO to a sales manager. Then, like Jen, took the leap over to marketing with the CMO. And now previously the past 10 years have spent as a CEO of mostly SaaS tech businesses. And then currently, obviously, Challenger being a tech-enabled services business. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Amazing to have someone with your expertise on the panel to kind of talk especially about methodologies. Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daryl. Nice to be on the panel with you, Jen and Andee. I'm Jeff Roy. I'm the head of sales with BioRender. BioRender is actually a software solution for research scientists. So we have millions of research scientists all over the world who actually use BioRender to visualize and communicate their science. Prior to that, I was with InVision, and I've also worked with LinkedIn and Salesforce over the course of my third decade now in software and sales. So pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, before we jump into the hard-hitting content, we'll let a couple more folks join the webinar here. We thought we would just open up with a really light icebreaker. And so maybe we'll go in the same order that we did introductions, but would love to hear just what your favorite summer memory of 2023 is so far.
Okay, I think that makes me first. I'll go first. My favorite is going to see the band Lord Huron. I don't know if anybody knows them, likes them. They played up in Evanston at an outdoor concert. We took our little kids, and our kids were so cool and they loved it. So I love music, and I love anytime our kids get to experience that with us too. So that was my favorite.
That's awesome. Summer concerts are the best. And for the audience that are on already, feel free to contribute your favorite summer memory from 2023 in the chat. But Andee, we'll hear from you.
No surprise, Jen and I are on the same wavelength. I was literally like, I live in the city of Chicago, through street festivals, live music, just being able to walk out your door and hear great music. But some special memories were Windy City Smokeout. I have never been a huge country music fan, but my daughter introduced it to me driving to all these softball games this summer, and I got really into it. And so it was really fun, like Jen, with the kids and my husband, and just really enjoying some fun country music. And I will say she made me a believer. So it was a growth mindset opportunity for me as well. So.
Oh, that's amazing. Jeff, over to you.
Cool. Well, I'm a father of 3, so I would probably be remiss if I didn't mention my children in my favorite summer memory thus far. But I took my my daughters backcountry camping with me, and they caught a fish bigger than probably a smallmouth bass, bigger than any I ever remember catching. So that was a pretty cool memory for all of us. That's
awesome. Does it get bigger every time they retell the story?
It gets bigger every time I retell the story. That's for sure.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, well, let's get into this. I think a ton of people have signed up for this, largely because of all of you to discuss this important topic, and especially given kind of the economic environment or the selling environment that we're in right now. So I thought we could start a little bit high level in terms of like, why are sales methodologies such an important focus for revenue leaders today? I'm really curious about like what you're seeing when it comes to going back to kind of prioritizing this strategic selling or value selling. And maybe Jeff, we'll kind of start with you.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm sure like Jen and Andee, I could probably riff on this topic for hours myself. So I'll do my best to sort of give you an abbreviated answer here. I think certainly like, anyone who's in sales would agree, like it's a difficult macro environment to sell in. And I've lived through a couple of these cycles now. I've sold through a couple of these cycles. And a former mentor of mine at Salesforce, shout out to Tony Rodoni, used to say when things get difficult in sales, like any real discipline, I think it's important to go back to the fundamentals and make sure that you're doing those really well. And so undoubtedly having a really good, tight, well-defined sales process is one of the fundamentals. I will say a couple of things in addition to that. Like I would like to think that anybody who's been a part of one of my teams would agree, am the type of person that puts tremendous value in two things: mindset and the culture within your team. And I think both of those are incredibly important to take a good look at before you think about doubling down on process or re-implementing a process. And ask yourself, are you really at a point where your team is cultivating the right mindset? Do they have a belief in continuous learning? Have you created an environment where people aren't afraid to fail and they're willing to try new things and learn from that? And then I also think, like, as it relates to culture, have you communicated as a leader a set of standards and values that everyone knows are how they're going to be evaluated and are things that people are rallied around upholding? And, have you created an environment where you've got an inspiring mission where people really feel motivated to do their best work? And there's lots of good books you can read on this too that I really like are Mindset and Culture Code. I think both really speak to how to effectively implement these things for a team and for yourself as an individual. And the reason I say that that's important is because like selling is incredibly difficult. It's not difficult, in my opinion, like some disciplines are, like the medical profession or being a lawyer, because there's a lot of technical complexity. Selling is difficult because it's emotionally very difficult to navigate how to be disciplined, how to maintain motivation, how to be determined to continually succeed. So I think you have to start there as a foundation to build off of before you implement a methodology. Once you have a good start, I think that's when you can look at implementing methodology. And a couple quick comments on methodology. I think it all has to start with deep empathy for the buyer. You can't and shouldn't impose a methodology on your team or your buyer that feels like it's happening to them instead of for them. It should all be in service of helping your buyer get to an educated yes/no decision that is going to produce the best outcome for them in the most time efficient and effective way possible. And I think as long as you start there as a first step, I think you're going to end up in a good place. And I think you also really need to keep it oriented in a belief that you should be doing things and focusing on things that are genuinely in the best interest of your team and your customer, versus like maybe implementing a methodology that you've implemented because you feel like it's the textbook way to sell. I think you have to take a real honest look at, what are my things doing? What are my team doing today that's working? What are the things that I can learn from the success that we're currently having? And then how do I tailor and customize a methodology that makes sense for my buyer, my team, the industry we're selling to, the size of customer, the size of deal that we're doing? So there's a certain amount of like customization you need to do before implementing a methodology. But I do believe a lot of sales organizations going back to it for good reason, because we are selling an environment where you just can't take anything for granted. So you do have to double down on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think, you talked about sort of philosophically thinking about what needs to happen before you get into a methodology or before you decide on which methodology you want to run with. And I think there's a lot of blockers, right? Like, I think a lot of people agree that we need methodologies. It's like, what are the blockers to actually getting them implemented? And you touched on a couple, but Jen, I'm super curious to get your perspective, given that, yes, you're demand gen now, but you were at Challenger, and so you probably have some really good perspective on what this looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was someone who, I wish I started off as an A+ salesperson. I wasn't. I was totally average. And when I learned Challenger, it did change me. But I can also recognize my aversion to change back then. I think the thing we neglect to remember sometimes is what we say and do, what comes out of our mouth as salespeople is how we make our money. And so you can hold up all the evidence in the world that I should change. It's still a deeply personal decision. And a lot of factors around me matter to how much I will lean in or lean out from it. So there's three big ones. And I know Andee will weigh in here too as well, because she sees these all the time too. So the first one is sales manager buy-in, right? Like, you can sit there in that classroom and be like, this is how we want you to sell. And then my manager comes back the next day and teaches me the same stuff they told me before. Who am I going to listen to? The random trainer who shows up or my sales manager? I'm going to listen to my sales manager. So winning the hearts and minds of the manager is something I always admired about the Challenger methodology. Second thing is winning the hearts and minds of the salespeople. Just because you spent $1 million on a sales methodology does not mean that I, as a seller, am going to adopt it. And so one of the things I talked about when I posted about this event is just how much people focus on picking the right methodology. And then once they pick it, it's like an afterthought. Like, there's so much change management that I didn't even appreciate when I first started selling Challenger that matters into how likely someone is to adopt it or ignore it. And then the third one is, sometimes I think the dangerous trap we fall into with methodology is we spend a lot of time talking about the theory of what and not the theory of how. So when I first learned Challenger, I was like, yeah, I can tell you what it is. It's teach, tailor, take control, constructive tension. I'll give you the definitions and do I get my A? But I actually really struggled to connect that to the everyday activities that I was doing. Like, I was like, I know what Challenger is. I don't know how to write an email like a Challenger. I don't know how to open up a call. I don't know how to do discovery like a Challenger. And so I think one of the other big failure points or risk points is making sure we're not just talking in theory, but we're giving the sales, the team, the marketing team, the product team, really concrete examples of what execution like that sounds like on the front line. So those are the three big things that I think I encountered most when I saw people who, not just Challenger, but just in general, had failure points with methodologies.
That's amazing. And timely, given that that poll just ended and said that methodologies are more relevant today than they ever have been before. Andee, I'm sure you can build off some of those things, but I'm also just curious. I mean, you probably have hundreds of conversations a year where people are coming to you saying, it's going to be the silver bullet. We want a new methodology. We're looking at these ones. Like, how do you help guide them through that process?
Yeah, I mean, echoing off what Jeff and Jen said, a lot of it is truly like, is the organization ready for this? Is it something that they're open to change, open to transformation? And that's really where we start. And because it isn't just a playbook, it is really like thinking differently about how you sell, what you bring to the table, and really, especially things like constructive tension is really hard for people. They're like, especially if you're like a relationship builder. And if you're not familiar with Challenger, we have 5 types of salespeople, and one of them, and I myself am a recovering relationship builder. And when you say to a relationship builder, hey, you got to build constructive tension, that's really, really hard, right? So I think that for us, it's like, are you ready as an organization to change? And some of the factors that weigh into that are things like, do you have sales enablement? So often when Challenger lives within a sales enablement team. And if you look at the research, sales enablement is actually a relatively new function. It's been around really in the past 5 years. So when we see that Challenger is falling within the sales enablement team, that's really helpful for us because we know that they're really good at getting salespeople to do things. Nothing against learning and development teams and training and learning development teams, but they have a lot on their plate and they're trying to get more of a, I would say more of a compliance focus. Like, here's the training, go do this. Where when I love working with sales enablement teams, because I do think that a lot of Challenger is really, if you think about cultures, like, Jeff, you were talking a lot about culture. It's really like, are you a compliant culture or are you more of like letting your salespeople judge for themselves how to bring their best selves and their mindset, allowing them to do things like commercial insights and teaching to their customers. And so I think a lot of that too is looking at the culture, looking at what teams they have in place. The last thing I'll just say is really that reinforcement piece, really understanding the tech environment, because what we've learned at Challenger, sort of forced via COVID, but what we've really learned is that an 8-hour training session at a sales kickoff is really not the most effective way. Your teams haven't seen each other in 3 years. They might have been out at the bar a little too late, catching up with team members. And so to try to get them to shove 8 hours of training down their throats the next day is really challenging. So really thinking about reinforcement, whether that's through a 2-hour virtual training session, but we're really trying to think of delivery and the idea of more of that bite-sized small, more digestible training, and then really thinking about how do you reinforce those behaviors. As we know, behavior change is hard. The average person takes about 6 months to implement a behavior change. So what are you doing along the way to constantly reinforce that behavior change? And like Jen said, making sure your managers are modeling that behavior time and time again.
Yeah, that's great. So many good nuggets there for the audience who's kind of thinking about methodologies, or even ones that have maybe just implemented it. It's not like a quick fix, a quick 8-hour training, and then boom, you have this new methodology. It's a process, and you need to probably be patient with it a little bit and make sure that you're reinforcing it along the way. One of the things that I think about with methodologies is it's really nothing more than sort of a framework or a guideline on how to do incredible deal execution. We refer to that at Accord as 10 out of 10 execution. We don't think 9 out of 10 is enough. That last one is really important. And so I'd love to hear from each of you on how you think about sort of elite deal execution. And we will go sort of Jeff, Jen, and Andee in that order in terms of your own organization. Do you guys have a framework? Do you have a checklist? Like, how do you think about rolling out elite deal execution?
Elite deal execution. Well, as a sales leader, I would say elite deal execution is any that works and gets you to,
especially in this economy.
Yeah, it gets you to you and your buyer to an ideal outcome. I often start with sort of like principles as organizing, theories to work from, and then get more into the specifics. I think, elite deal execution looks like anything where you've created a genuine plan to identify and solve real customer problems. And the outcome is either you're shaking hands and walking away friends, or there's a fair exchange of value for the service or the software that you're providing to them. And so I think any process that you can design, any methodology that you can implement that gets you to that point is probably elite. To make it a little more tactical, I would say, and I agree with what Sean said in the comments too, in my experience, the more generic your methodology feels, the more generic your process feels, the less elite it likely is. I think there are great principles in Challenger. We use a lot of Challenger principles in our methodology today. We have probably a combination of several different methodologies that I've been fortunate to work with and study over the years in how we sell at BioRender. But I do think you've got to take an honest look at what are the steps that get our buyer to an educated yes/no decision, like I said, in the most efficient and effective way possible. And then you've got to tailor it a little bit. Like we learned, as an example, at BioRender, that leading with insights, because we have lots of data around the scientists that use our product, what elite scientists who are communicating their work really effectively do behaviorally, what are the outcomes they produce, and teaching the members of the organizations that we're trying to sell to, the constituents in those organizations, what those behaviors are, leveraging data to do so is a really powerful way for us to start a conversation. That's been a really effective approach for us. So this is just a way in which we've adopted a specific principle to help our sellers here.
Awesome. Demand Gen, we're going to go over you, and I love that they're just building off this in the chat. We've got the next generation. They want to be part of the next generation of the chat. Let's hear from the next generation.
Yeah. So 2 words come to mind when I think of elite deal strategy. One is consistency. So I've worked for a lot of different sales leaders in my life, and the very best ones were consistent in how they reviewed deals every week. And I know it sounds obvious and probably simple and stupid, but when I have no idea what you expect of me and what's important as it relates to reviewing a deal, I inevitably will always be unprepared for a deal review. And so I had a manager, Andee knows him too, that would come to every deal review and say, if you can't tell me what this company sells, how they sell it, and who they sell it to, you don't even belong here because you don't even have a deal. And that, I messed up. One time I was like, oh yeah, they're in ed tech. And he's like, that's not what I asked. But that held me accountable to knowing I would never show up again to another deal review not knowing those 3 questions. So it doesn't have to be those 3 questions, but I think one of the really important things for leaders and managers to understand is just by virtue of asking the same questions again and again that align to your methodology, you teach sellers through repetition what to expect and what's important. So that's the first word. And the second word is just considering the environment we're in, kind of going back to your initial question, why is methodology resurfacing? And I'm so glad that it is if you think about the last few years, we went through this like really high demand, cash rich environment where we are hiring salespeople like crazy. They're 6 months into their role. They get 250% a goal and they're like, I'm an amazing seller. And then the rug comes out from under them and they're like, what happened? And I think what we started to realize is this competitor that's always been there, which is status quo, or indecision, which Challenger and Jolt do a great job of talking about, is now our biggest competitor. And so I think when I think about an elite deal review today, I think it has to factor in the competition that you might not lose because of your price, your brand, your product, any of that stuff. You might just lose because the customer is so freaking scared of doing anything at all and making themselves look bad. And so when you're reviewing deals, one thing I wish I heard more sales leaders asking about is like, what is the status quo alternative if they don't go with us? It's not just us and their two competitors. Chances of them DIYing something or doing nothing at all and punting this out is a choice. And so making sure deal reviews factor that too. So those would be my two.
Yeah, I love that. Status quo is definitely the common enemy across every sales organization. Andee, we'll hear from you.
Yeah. I'm just gonna keep following Jen because this is like working out perfectly. It's like the layup. So like, but yeah, I mean, Jen referenced Jolt, which is a big piece of what we're doing at Challenger. It's really that Challenger plus Jolt is this idea of 1 + 1 = 3 around indecision. And if you look at your pipeline, we're now seeing that close to 38% of deals are ending in no decision. And that's pretty alarming, right? If you think about your pipeline, and we're working so hard to get things in that funnel, right? So definitely thinking about, and so really, I think a few things that we really focus on. One is that rather than focus on ROI, focus on COI, and COI is the cost of inaction. So really thinking about, to Jen's point about status quo, like COI, what would happen to this customer if they did nothing at all? Instead of saying, here's your ROI, we can give you this, and you'll make back the money. And the CFO is like, I don't really care. I don't want to spend money on anything right now. So I think really thinking of that, we also call it like FOMO, right? That fear of missing out, right? Like really like, this is your moment to do something about this. And if you don't do this, like what will actually happen? And so we really focus on that. And then the last thing I would just say, because Jeff and Jen did such a good job of talking about it, is really around coaching. I think that often, if you think about the sales career, the career progression of a sales leader, they often come up through because they're a really great individual contributor and they have incredible numbers, and they're, we call them a lone wolf often in the Challenger world, but they've come up and they've never really had to coach. And I think people confuse deal review with coaching. And, I would say that that's something, if, we really try to focus on with our leaders and our managers, is really thinking about coaching, because we know at the end of the day, that's what's most important. And so, not jumping into every single detail of the deal, but really thinking holistically about how do you teach them to continue to be able to do this on their own. And to Jen's point, like consistently show up that way.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to put a pin in coaching because I think it's a topic we should come back to, especially with the three of you. But I do want to pull in the audience a little bit. There's a question out there that basically asks, how would you define a sales methodology? I talked to 10 leaders within my company who all wanted a new methodology, but got 10 different definitions of what a sales methodology means to them. So, maybe, I know you just went, but Andee, maybe back to you, given kind of your expertise, and then we'll go in reverse order to Jen and then Jeff.
Yeah, so I think a methodology is really like a framework, right? Thinking about a mindset, thinking about how do people follow that sales process, and really making sure, once again, it adds consistency. So for example, at Challenger, the first piece of that is teach. So making sure that every single one of your reps understand the difference between just going there and showing somebody a demo, or, like teach them something about their business that they might not have thought of. You could say something along the lines of, I've talked to 25 CIOs and they're all struggling with the same issue. Is this something that resonates with you, right? Thinking about really, how do you create that insight or something very unique to them? So I think that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is tailoring your messaging. And that's really making sure that, Jeff, you talked about generic messaging, right? You want to make sure that your methodology isn't generic and you're really focusing in on what makes them unique. And keep in mind, in this environment, we know that the sales process is quite elongated, and you're now talking to procurement, you're talking to CFOs, you're talking to, business users, other stakeholders. So you've got to really think about how you tailor your message to what's most important to them. A CFO message is going to look very different than a business owner's message. So really thinking about that. And then the last piece for the challenger methodology is take control. And that's really this idea of, I think as salespeople, we've all talked about this. When the economy is good, everyone thinks they're a great seller, right? It's like, hey, I'm an order taker. Yeah, let me just keep on taking those orders. But when the economy is tough, really that constructive tension that, hey, if I do this for you, what are you going to do for me? How that dance, like that really thinking about like, how do you sort of like really make sure that you're still in the driver's seat? Because one of the biggest reasons for indecision is not taking control of that deal and letting the buyer set the timeline, set what's best for them. So really helping them understand the urgency of like what needs to get done and when. So that's more of like our framework, but I mean, there's lots of frameworks out there. What I would caution people against is really thinking about a playbook, which is just hey, here's your script, here's how to do it, versus a true behavior change transformation. Because I think the best sellers really grow and learn. And, Jen just talked about this, but like they really transform the way they sell versus just a playbook that's like, hey, when they want a demo, say this, right? That's a very different world.
Awesome. Jen, we'll kick over to you.
Yeah, I think this is a question I got a lot when I was selling, and I had a really terrible answer in the beginning. So over time, I tried to make it better. So we'll see how this lands. I think sales process is the what. Like those are the steps I take in pursuit of making a sale. Sales methodology is the how I move through those steps and the beliefs and assumptions that I hold as a seller. So one of the best lessons I learned was anytime we make a decision as a human being, it's guided by a set of beliefs and assumptions. This is especially true in sales. Those beliefs and assumptions can be formed from like, hey, I worked in a sales role at this company and it worked for me there, or I saw someone over here do it and it worked for them, so I'm going to do that. I think methodology at times is super, super overcomplicated. It is aligning the organization, sales, marketing, product, CEO, everybody from the bottom to the top around what actually makes us win and what are the things that hold us back from winning. And so if you have like 16 different methodologies in place, it's really hard as an organization to understand what's working and what's not, because you can't actually like isolate it because you've got so many different experiments going around. So I think for organizations, I'm not saying everybody needs a rigid model and everybody should just do one thing. But I do think this tendency I saw a lot of like, well, let's just kind of do a little bit of it all, puts us in a really difficult place because then it's really hard to know how to fix and what to fix. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, that's great. Jeff, anything to add on this one?
I like Jen's definition of a what and how. And I will just say, I think, where I've probably made mistakes myself in implementing methodology and where I've seen other leaders make mistakes is not spending enough time on the how. Like if sales was simply a framework that we all followed, it would be easy. It's the nuance and the artistry and, the discipline to do the hard things day in and day out, and just knowing what to do, the actual how, that I think is really the job of an effective leadership team to help unravel and decipher for their team. And so spending a lot of time on the how and really thinking through at each step in your process, like when you want somebody on your team to do something, how are they actually going about doing that? Because I think that's the question that most sellers have. You come to them and you're like, you look at MEDDPICC and MEDDPICC and the checklist that exists, and it's like, you got to get the economic buyer involved in your deal. Great. Like, I've emailed the CEO a bunch of times and called them and they're not calling me back. So I'd love some insight from you on how we actually get them involved, because I know I'm supposed to do it, but I don't know how to do it. Or I've tried a lot of different things and they haven't worked. So I think spending a lot of time on the how is really super important.
That's a really good point. There's another question in the audience that I think is one that we can spend a bit of time on, which is, has B2B buyers changed? Have they changed in what they expect in the last 5 years? And when I was at Salesforce in the Pardot days, we used to talk about how like buyers would show up with like 80% of the evaluation already done, right? They went to the website, they did all their research. And so if you kind of take that as the new norm, how would you say the buyer process or the seller process or that dance has changed in the last, I'd even say 10 years, but Andee, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, so Challenger just did a study on this, and people are around 62% through the buying process before they even want to contact a sales rep. And actually, the most alarming statistic we saw was that 92% of Gen Y buyers would prefer never to talk to a sales rep and just do all their research online. So when you think about, you've got it's kind of stacked against you, right? So the idea is that, when they do pick up the phone to call you, one, they've done a ton of research. They've been at G2 Crowd, they've been online, they've talked to other stakeholders, to other customers. And so the idea is that the minute they pick up the phone, you've got to really offer them something, and that's where that teaching plays in, a commercial insight, something that's really interesting, engage them. We always tell people get away from the pitch deck, right? They already know where you're located. They already know how many employees you have. They already know your customer base. Just throw it all out. That pitch deck is not going to work, and really have a conversation about what they're trying to do, how you can partner with them, how you can teach them something that you've learned from other customers or other experiences. So I think that's the number one thing that we really want to make sure people are doing, is just really understanding where people are in that buying process. And the last thing I would say about that is really thinking about discovery. I think people back in the day used to love those long lists of discovery questions, like what keeps you up at night, and that's another area where once again, go follow them on LinkedIn, go figure out, you should already know that. So once again, just asking them those questions, I immediately would just turn it off. I'd be like, yeah, I'm done, bye. So
that's great. Jen, you want to add something to this one?
Yeah, I love Andee's point. I think when I first started selling, I could go into a call and be like, all right, let's do a deep discovery and let's talk about what you need. And I think over time, what's happened, as Andee described, with buyers learning on their own, it's the worst, most cringeworthy thing you can do is just show up and be like, let's do some needs analysis. They're like, I already did it. And that's why I think as salespeople, we get pushed down, because we have a reputation for wasting people's time on jobs they've already done. And so I know Gong had put out a study in March that was so disheartening to see, that said only 25% of buyers felt that the seller even understood their role. I'm like, that is the lowest possible bar we can get. And then when you get down, as it went through, only 6% felt like they learned something new from the seller. That is our big open white space, right? I think in a sales motion, what used to work really well was you call me, I ask you a bunch of questions, I come back a week later, I'm like, here's what you need. Now I think what customers are really looking for is what have I missed? Not what do I need, but what have I missed in my own learning? And if they're not getting that from a salesperson, chances are they're going to talk to other people who may push them in a different direction. So I think all that is to say, the bar is so much higher for us to be salespeople today. We can't just show up and take, we have to come up and give. And that give has to be about their business, not ours, which is why I think, obviously spending as much time as I did at Challenger really helped me, because it taught me to bring something to that sales experience instead of simply extracting. So definitely tougher to be a salesperson today than ever before.
And one thing I'll just add to what Jen said is, we really talk about this a lot at Challenger. If you want to just distill it down to the basics, be a nutritionist, not a waitress, right? When you think about a restaurant and, a waitress just takes your order and is like, sure, that's great. Have, we use this analogy at Challenger, have a cherry pie. Whereas the nutritionist might say, is that really the best thing? I know you're trying to watch your diet, you're trying to think about, what you're eating. It's, and maybe just a bowl of fresh cherries would be better. So really that analogy of be the nutritionist, not the waitress. It's way harder to be the nutritionist. You've got to push back. You've got to teach them something. But at the end of the day, they're going to feel a lot better after they ate that bowl of cherries versus the cherry pie. Most people,
That's a really good point. Being coming with
as I'm doing this over lunchtime, I'm like, oh, now that sounds really good.
Yeah. As you're saying, has a bowl of cherries ever been better than cherry pie?
I'll give Allie Manning and our team credit for that analogy. It wouldn't have been it totally works. I think about it all the time, actually.
So good. Jeff, you want to chime in here?
I just say I really agree with what both Jen and Andee said. I think it's incredibly hard to be a seller these days. I think the expectations are higher. The willingness, the need, the desire of a customer to actually want to speak to a salesperson is decreased dramatically in the time that I've been selling. So I think the most important early step in a sales process, and if you don't have a defined methodology or framework for how an AE on your team goes about doing research for a prospective customer and account, you should define that as part of a sales process. Every sales process that I've ever implemented starts with a really well-defined methodology and framework around account research, because I think coming into the conversation with a point of view on how you can help them, with a perspective on other customers that you've helped that look like them, knowing and understanding the problems they're likely encountering, validating that with the customer, avoiding generic discovery questions are like, I mean, that's a need to have these days. That's not a step that you can miss if you're looking to increase the likelihood that your team's winning.
Yeah, I totally agree. So interesting. I guess maybe this is why we had such big numbers for this, is the poll just came back that 21% think that their methodology is working for them currently. So 1 in 5 of the folks on here think that it's doing what it needs to do. And I think it kind of speaks to the behavior change and how hard that is, right? Like, you know, Jen actually put out an awesome post leading up to this around how do you like find a methodology and how much work that can be and how long it can take. But then once you pick it and commit to it, like how do you actually get it working in your organization? So we're going to take the pin out of that coaching conversation. Jeff, maybe we'll start with you. And you talked a little bit about, of course, I want to get to the CEO who's the economic buyer, but that's not that easy to do. How do you coach your team on some of those more difficult things to do?
How do I coach my team? I think, you know, you have to earn the right to genuinely coach someone. Like you can, like, if we're speaking open and honestly, like you can give people feedback anytime you want, and their willingness to accept that feedback, you know, may or may not be there depending on the relationship that you have. But to genuinely get into like a meaningful coaching conversation where you're going through a process of self-exploration with the person you're attempting to coach is something you have to earn the right to do. And you have to earn the right to do that by, you know, building a relationship with them that goes beyond just the number that you're looking for them to deliver to the team. You have to know what motivates them as a person, who they are as a person. Like, you know, this is where like the emotional, irrational human element comes into play, because I just think you can't even really get into a coaching conversation with somebody until you've kind of built a foundation of trust, because it requires people to really admit and acknowledge like where they're not doing enough or where they think they're probably failing or struggling. And if you don't have trust with the people that you're attempting to coach, like no one's going to openly admit that to you, or the likelihood they openly admit that to you is limited. So I think I take stock of the relationship that I have with the individual, and like I genuinely ask myself, like, I'm at a place where I feel like I've earned the right to coach this person. And if I'm not, then I try and tackle that first. And then once I get there, I think, you know, as sales leaders, most often coming from a background of sales ourselves. So I think great coaching is similar to great discovery, and that you're not attempting to tell the person what to do. You're really helping them go through a process of self-discovery themselves to come up with their own answer. And that's how you truly like create lasting change in an individual, I believe anyways. And that's like, look, elite coaching is really, really difficult. So, you know, takes a lot of practice, and I don't think you could be too hard on yourself if, you know, the first couple of times you try it, you're not there, or you're not there with everybody on your team. Because currently I'm not there with everybody on my team. It takes time to build that trust.
Yeah, that's amazing. Not surprised that you'd have a super thoughtful answer there, that given that this is something that I think you're known for in the industry. Jen, any thoughts on the coaching piece?
Yeah, I have never been a manager, a VP, any of that. I'm a weirdo. I loved being a lifelong seller. So I will simply speak to things that managers did to me that I really appreciated. I'm going to go back to one thing I said earlier. It is consistency. I have worked for managers that have been all over the board. 1 week, this was important. The next week, this was important. And it's just really hard to be successful or trust in your manager. To your point, Jeff, about what I am expected to do and the threshold of like how I am expected to do it. I think the other thing that really great managers I've worked for have done is they have resisted the urge to tell. This is why I love seeing teachers move out of education and into sales. Not, I mean, I'm a stepmom, so I don't love seeing them leave our schools, but I do think they make phenomenal sales managers because they have the patience that's required to let someone figure it out on their own. I think I've worked for managers that have told me what to do, and maybe it's just my style of learning, but it rarely sticks because then I'm just doing what they told me. If someone helps me answer questions and get to the root cause of why I believe something, and then introduces information that changes that belief, that is inherently stickier because I am coming to that conclusion kind of on my own. Not really, I'm being guided. But I think that's, to Andee's point earlier, when we look at the people who move up into sales manager roles, oftentimes it's star performers and they're just trying to create mini-me's. And that often doesn't work. You can be a phenomenal star performer, but if my style is not at all like you, that's very, very unhelpful to me. So I think focusing on consistency and focusing on teaching, not telling.
That's great. I love that you came at it from the perspective of not leading before, but really what works for you and kind of what gets you moving in the right direction. And consistency is something that I hear from a lot of people that are in the field, so that they know when they wake up on Monday what the expectations are.
Yeah.
Andee, I bet you have a few points on this one.
Just a few. Well, one thing this study just really alarmed me, but also it was really interesting. Bain did a study in 2021 around sales AEs, and they asked them if they would pay $1 for an hour of coaching time with their sales manager, and only 50% of them were willing to do that. So, just really this idea that like people don't see value in a lot of the sales managers and the coaching that they're getting. And so we have a huge opportunity to teach people how to coach. So that's just one thing, when you're thinking about, and to Jen's point, right? Like, walking someone through a deal, but really teaching them the skills and the consistency is so important. The last thing I would just say is like, it goes back to mindset, like thinking about co-elevation. So really thinking about how am I elevating this person and how am I bringing them together? And I think if we look at our sales team more around co-elevating them together versus like, this is my good sales rep that's a problem child, and this is the sales rep. Like, I think it's really this idea of co-elevating the entire team. And being authentic with your teams. Like I, as a CEO, I don't have all the answers. I think I often try to say like, I don't know. Sometimes I need your help, and I think that's okay. And I think being as authentic as you can, whether you're coaching somebody, whether you're leading a company, none of us have a crystal ball. I wish I did.
Yeah, I feel like this is one of those topics that we probably should have a whole masterclass on, and we can kind of go on and on. It actually reminds, as you're saying that, it reminds me of this poll that one of the best leaders, I actually never had a chance to work for him personally, but just by reputation at Salesforce, is this guy named Mike Wolf. And Mike would he would poll his sellers every month one question: would you fight to work with your leader again? And it was very binary, but it's also like it pulls on the emotion. Like, you're not just going to say yes to that question if you didn't feel super passionate that you were getting some good coaching and great leadership. So love that one.
Great.
We'll go back to some of the things that we were kind of thinking about coming into this, which is, we were talking a lot about this concept of like back to basics. And, we talked a little bit earlier that that's probably not the right term, because in a complex selling environment, there's nothing really basic about it. But maybe back to the fundamentals is a better way to say it. And I'm curious, as each of you kind of think about kind of that journey of becoming a 10 out of 10 seller, right? We don't come out of school and be the best salesperson. Well, some people are pretty good right out of school, but most of us take a lot of learning and education and coaching along the way. What did that journey either maybe look like for you to start? And then what would you guide someone on what they should do to get there faster? And Jen, we haven't started with you in a while, so we'll go to you on this one.
Great. I have to say something intelligent. This actually picks up on a question Sean Hewley, hopefully I'm answering or saying your name correctly, in the chat was asking, which is, I think when you reflect on how most sales reps are brought into an organization, what's the first thing we do? We like fire hose them with what our product does and why our product's so great and why all of our competitors suck. And so they come out of that training. Of course, what they're going to talk about is our product, because that's exactly what we've told them to talk about. And so I think for me, when I noticed my performance start to improve, it was when I became less of a one-trick pony, meaning I could talk to you all day long about training and what's good about training and how to stop training, but I couldn't talk about any of the other issues that a CRO cared about, right? So I couldn't, when a CRO was coming to me being like, we might do training, we might implement a piece of tech, we might change our CRM, we might do a reorg, we might fire our sales team. Like, I was like, well, I can't speak to any of that stuff, but I can tell you all day long what you should do with training. It made me unhelpful as a resource. So I wasn't brought in again until that buyer decided, if they decided, that training was the answer. So for me, I think like when I think about getting back to basics, I think it's an underappreciated basic, which is that we have to teach our sellers business acumen, customer acumen outside of just the space that we sell, because it is no longer enough. It was enough before. It's not enough anymore. So I have to be able to help a buyer think through the trade-offs of, if I pull the lever on a reorg versus if I buy a methodology, what are the pros and cons of that? And I think that's where you start to see the 10 out of 10 sellers stepping ahead of the pack, because buyers can come to them because they realize you're not just trying to sell me something, you're helping me, aiding me in making a decision. So I think it's a really hard basic, but it's become candidly like a basic expectation for today.
Yeah, totally agree. Jeff, you want to go next?
Elite selling, I would say cultivating the right mindset, is a really good starting point. I've talked about it, but I do think that is a foundation upon which you have to really build everything else from in order to be a great and elite seller. So how are you doing that with your team when you talk about from a personal development and mindset perspective? And then I love what Jen said. I think every elite seller I've ever had the opportunity to work with in my career has been a subject matter expert in what they were selling. And so not stopping at the sort of basic level training that you're required as a new employee or as an AE to take when you started an organization, but really going deep on your customer, going deep on the product, knowing their business, knowing the common challenges that they face, like being able to essentially work with them the same way that a management consultant would. And that's sort of an ethos that I encourage my team to really embrace, is like, don't think of yourself as a salesperson, think of yourself as a management consultant that's going in and genuinely trying to diagnose the problems of your business and prescribe a solution that's going to help them. And so in order to really be able to do that, you have to have a lot of deep subject matter expertise.
Yeah. All right, Andee, we are almost
I'll bring it home.
I
I think the thing that we haven't touched on is sales experience. So I think that, some of the research we've done at Challenger is around what actually builds customer loyalty. So for those of you that are in SaaS and, thinking about renewability and reoccurring revenue, what builds customer loyalty is actually that sales experience at the very beginning. And so at Challenger, we actually developed a product called Loop. And the reason why we felt so strongly about it was we really wanted to measure the sales experience from what the actual prospect was experiencing, because often, as managers, we might do a diagnostic, or we might watch a gong call and say like, oh, I think you should do this or that, but really understanding what is the experience on the other end. And often people get stuck on product and features and brand reputation and all of those things. But to be honest, 53% of customer loyalty comes from that sales experience, those interactions. And so really understanding like what is driving that sales experience is critical. So I would say that to me is the most important thing.
Love it. That's a perfect place, I think, to end this. What an action-packed 45 minutes of learning why revenue leaders are doubling down on sales methodologies. Andee, Jen, Jeff, thank you so much for bringing your insights to the table. And we will make sure the recording gets to all of you if you want to kind of double click on anything here, and we'll follow up in a blog as well if you want to ask some questions. So thanks everyone for the time, and hope to see you out in the field.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.